What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Today, we'll be chatting with Doug Norrie from Locked On Nets as the Nets went into Media Day as one of the teams with the most questions circling around their organization. Did they win Media Day? Did they lose Media Day? How confident should Nets fans be in the organization, in Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and Ben Simmons moving forward after Nets Media Day? We're going to get there in just a moment after a quick message from our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your football betting info this season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every single game that you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every single sport out there. In fact, right now, you can head over to BetOnline to take a look at who the odds-on favorites are for this year's NBA title. Leading the way at the very top of the bracket are the Golden State Warriors at plus 575 for this year's title odds. Then you got the Boston Celtics in second place at plus 600. Milwaukee Bucks and Giannis Antetokounmpo at plus 700. And then rounding out the top five, you have the Brooklyn Nets and the LA Clippers at plus 750 apiece. So for all of that and more odds, head over to betonline.net to learn more about the trends in action available to you. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Joining us now is Doug Norrie from Locked On Nets. You can follow on Twitter at Doug Norrie. Now, Doug, we just got done with media days all around the NBA, and one of the biggest ones that we were kind of waiting to see how it all played out, what happened, would be the Brooklyn Nets media day. And I think I'm curious to know your thoughts, but I walk away after hearing some of what those guys talked about, Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons. I walk away thinking some cautious optimism, maybe, if you're a fan of the Brooklyn Nets, if you're, pulling for that franchise. But let's start with Kevin Durant, who kind of discussed, a little bit of his thought process and what went into the trade request, why he was upset, really highlighted, a lack of accountability, I guess, within the organization, talked about, the fact that when he went down due to injury, they plummeted in the standings, and he thought that really shouldn't have happened. And I think one of the bigger quotes that kind of made the rounds from Media Day, though, was KD saying, and I quote, "I don't feel like I've got to prove anything to Nets fans after 3 years. I'm committed to moving forward with this team. If you've got doubts, that's on you." And that just seems like a very KD quote through and through. But Doug, should Nets fans be more or less confident in KD's long-term future with this team after Media Day?
I think they can feel, like you said, cautious optimism was a good way to, I think, a good phrase. I think that, like, in general, I don't think you were going to hear any apologies from him around, I'm sorry that I requested a trade. I think he stands by why he originally did it. I think there was accountability from some other quotes that he had in this press conference on Media Day. He said, and I quote, he said, "We screwed up." He used a different word than screwed. He used a word that I don't want to throw out here now, but and that was a we part of it too. It's like he mentioned the part that you said about how the organization probably wasn't prepared to withstand his injury at the time. Some of that was not totally the organizational's fault, right? But in general, I think that there was some accountability by him. I think he explained sort of his thinking. And then when you say about, how he reacted toward where the Nets fans, should trust him or whatever, I that's really never been part of like what motivates him. So I'm not surprised to hear that. Because I think what you do know from KD, and he's proven this time and time again, is that when he steps on the court, you do get everything from him. And I think for him to hear questions like that is like, hey, my commitment is 100% all the time. Like, it's been some organizational failings, or maybe other people that are on the team, not showing up in shape or not playing, but it's never been me. Like, if I've been healthy, max minutes, MVP caliber level play. So I can see where he would push back on, should they trust him? Because when he recommits to the team, then he recommits to the team. Like, what else can you do? You can't disprove a false negative. So I walk away from the KD I came away from the KD comments, and I guess we'll talk about Kyrie and Simmons too, but I came away from the KD comments encouraged by the direction, because he was just honest and ready to move on.
Yeah, and the Kyrie comments are exactly where we're going next, because I thought Kyrie came across very, like, genuine in so many of his responses, just very transparent, very upfront about all the drama that this team faced, all the, uncertainty throughout the offseason. And even though he came across as genuine, though, I do think that there was, and maybe you could push back on this if you want, I think there was some moments with some lapses in maybe some self-awareness in what he was discussing, because there were points where, and I quote, right, Kyrie goes, "There was a level of uncertainty in this building, not just for last year, but for the last few years. And that accountability that he asked for, that KD asked for, should be available and accessible at all times. And we should have that type of environment." And that was one of those where you're kind of looking at Kyrie and you're like, okay, really? So who's missing out on the accountability? Who wasn't, available? Who was leading to some of the uncertainty? And so I do think Kyrie, you walk away thinking, okay, he was genuine. He answered the questions, in a good faith effort to shed light on the situation. But there were still some moments where you're like, come on, man, a lot of this falls back on you.
So this is like, this media day from him was this classic Kyrie experience. If you've covered him for the last couple seasons, or really just forever, is that in the moment, Kyrie actually is usually very honest. Like, he's very honest. He will say things that will be self-deprecating in like an honest way if he feels like he's screwed up. He's mentioned screwing up multiple times in his career after the fact. The problem is it's almost after the fact, and there will be other things that get in the way in the moment. And this is, I in general, his comments I thought were again genuine. I thought he did address some things that did not shed him in a good light. Like, for instance, when they mentioned the part where he heard about KD asking for the trade, he was like, yeah, dude, it was embarrassing, because he didn't know, right? So he was like, I was embarrassed because I didn't know. He mentions something else in those comments about whether or not he had suitors for to sign another contract, right? Because he was on the player option. He ultimately opted in. And he said there were some, but not many, admitting that, like, hey, not a lot of people came calling, and he had some repair work to do on his own reputation. Like, he was very honest about that stuff. And I honestly, Kyrie is often very honest about this stuff. And he will give kind of different kinds of quotes. The issue with him typically is there is a lack of self-awareness at times. And it just doesn't sometimes take him long to just say something else later that submarines the good thing that he just said, right? And so with him, though, I will say with KD and Kyrie, both of them, and to some degree too, to some degree, when it came to media day, I think you really can't win media day, but you can lose, right? Like, you can't, like, you're not going to come away a winner, but you can come away a loser. And the Nets were in prime territory here to come away losers in terms of how the perception of them was going into the season, and they didn't do that, right? I think that the answers were just honest enough, were just self-reflective enough, were just forward-thinking enough to come away ultimately positive, even if it wasn't just 100% across the board great quotes.
Yeah, and I'm inclined to fully agree with you there, Doug. I think that the Nets did as good of a job as one can, as good of a job as an organization can, given their circumstances all summer. And that brings us to Ben Simmons, who I think maybe the silver lining in all of this is that Ben Simmons seems confident, eager, ready to play, in a good spot mentally. Like, all the variables that you have to kind of consider when you're looking at Ben Simmons, and you're kind of like, I don't know, anxious about whether or not he's actually going to be on the court playing basketball again. He seems to be in a really good spot right now.
He had I would say he had like 2 media days. He had the Nets formal media day, and then he had the appearance with JJ Redick, which was an extended interview that he did a few days before that. So I kind of use those both as one big long Ben Simmons media day, because these are the most he's spoken really publicly since everything happened, outside of a few quotes here and there. But this is the first time where he really elaborated on his time away from the Sixers and everything that happened. You can't really listen to anything he said and not feel super encouraged about what's going forward. He's a very confident guy, probably overly confident, but that's fine. Like, you want your athletes to be, you'd rather have them more confidence than less if you're thinking about how the cup is filled. And so I think with him, there was some, again, almost like the KD and Kyrie piece, some self-reflection of, this is some things I wish I had done differently. Probably it was happy to just throw the Sixers under the bus with how they treated him, or how he perceived that they treated him. But when it came to getting ready for basketball, everything along those lines is exactly what you want to hear. And from the very early, just, obviously everything with open gym is going to make everything seem great, but the extension off media day with practices and stuff and how the guys seem to be mixing, they asked him how the basketball looked and he just said incredible, right? And I think with him, if you've heard him speak at length, he is a guy that takes what he does very seriously. He's proud of the things that he does really well on the court, of which there are many. There's obviously deficiencies, but they're going to be mitigated by playing with this team. And so when you listen to him talk, again, like you said, it was the perfect sort of, I'm confident, I'm healthy, the basketball looks good, I'm here to win. It's a lot of it's boilerplate, but again, just hearing it makes you sound good. I honestly, I expected to get very little out of media day. I came away probably a little more confident than is reasonable just based on quotes, which is a little dangerous, but Simmons was definitely part of that. Oh, and one more thing with him too. I will say with him, of the three guys, he's the one that if anyone who's completely had it with the media, it's Simmons. He's wants no part of it, cut off everybody's question. He started answering the questions halfway through the question because he just didn't want to be part of it. I do think there was he seemed the most angry of the three, but it wasn't really anger, just kind of annoyed by having to answer some of the questions.
Yeah, media day quotes are kind of the fool's gold of the NBA, right? Where if you start buying in too heavily into those, you could set yourself up for, some disappointment in the not so distant future. But I think in this case with the Nets, I think we're gonna, again, cautious optimism is probably the best word to use here. Last thing for you, Doug, quick hitter. Where are the Nets at health-wise regarding some of the other players on the roster? TJ Warren, Joe Harris. What are those guys looking like kind of, as we've navigated, this, first week of training camp or so and kind of moving into the preseason?
Yeah, so Warren was a bit of a surprise that he's going to be reevaluated in November. He was further away. I think it probably shed some light about how the Nets were able to get him very cheap. That obviously the medicals weren't 100% clear, so they got him at a minimum, and which was seemed like the upside was going to be amazing based on what he had done. But it's been so long for him now. It's 2 years away from the game basically, and still not cleared to play. I downgraded my expectations on that pretty significantly because we're just so far away from it. And when you just can't get healthy, it might not be. So he's November. I'm not sure what the contribution is going to be. Seth Curry is not 100% cleared to play yet. He's still recovering from off-season surgery. It doesn't sound like his timeline is as bad, but I don't know if he's going to be available for the first game. And then Harris is by all accounts cleared and ready to go. I do think they're going to tread lightly with him, and they have options. Luckily, you can see Royce O'Neal in the starting lineup instead. And so I think that with Harris ready to go, I think this first couple preseason games will tell us a lot about what those plans are. But so not 100% healthy, but not completely off the rails in terms of overall health.
How heavily should we buy into this Brooklyn Nets team after their, we'll call it a relative win on media day? What is this team going to look like if we actually do get to see the big three playing on the court with one another? Of course, you're going to have us covered for all of that and more over at Locked On Nets. Doug, I appreciate you stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
All right. Thanks for having me.